Hey there, this video is all about the new firmware, version 2, for the Sony FX3. And if you're a Sony user, you better be getting pretty excited because this is a huge improvement for this camera. I had an inkling, a suspicion, or like a theory that something like this was coming for the FX3. Now, I don't have the insider information, but when the update that came out recently for the A7S III came out, it didn't really have a big improvement for that camera. And I noticed they also didn't update the FX3, so I was thinking, all right, something big is coming. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to go and stick with the FX3 versus an A7S III. But anyways, with this update, it's closer to the FX6, but of course it doesn't take on the full cinema operating system like in the FX6 or the FX9, but it definitely gives this more distinction from the A7S III. And I know everyone understands that, oh, the A7S III and the FX3 are the same cameras inside, just the different ergonomics, layout, top handle, no EDF, all that kind of stuff. But right now, with this update, it is definitely much closer to an FX6. And I have to say, it's kind of like a entry-level cinema camera, because I think of the FX6 as a entry-level cinema camera, and this really is kind of like right in the middle between the mirrorless world and the cinema world. It kind of is a lot closer now, and it's awesome. So there are a few missing features that I really wish came with this update, which I'll talk about at the end of the video. But first, let's talk about the updates for this camera. Here's a list of features from the Sony website that are in this firmware update. To me, the biggest ones are going to be the different shooting modes, bringing Cine EI into this camera. Now, this is something that you only see in the FX6 and the FX9, so that's really cool. There's also some really cool updates to the menu system, and just the way that the camera looks while you're shooting is also a huge improvement. I'm not going to get into explaining how to update the firmware on this camera. Most of you guys can figure that out, but I will leave a link down below for the firmware update. Now, I've had a lot of trouble updating my firmware on Sony cameras using M1 Max, so my buddy Raphael made a video about how to make that happen, so I'll leave that link down below if you want to check that out. After you install the firmware update, it will erase all the settings in your camera, so make sure you go through and reset up your camera. But there's a cool thing that happens when you boot up the camera is that it asks you to change the auto temp setting to high basically right off the bat, so you don't have to dive into the menu system. So I guess they were sick of all people complaining about overheating and not knowing about that option. It comes up right away. I didn't get a chance to record it, but you'll see after you do this. Now let's dive into the menu system because there's some really cool updates in there. I know a lot of people give Sony crap because their menu systems are not ideal and they are long and lengthy and it's hard to find some stuff sometimes, but this really does change this quite a bit. So let me show you here. If you press the menu button, you see on the left-hand side all of the sort of normal menu folders that you have. But what's new here is this main 1 and main 2, which is where all the magic is happening. So if we go over here, you can actually work this with the touchscreen too, but I'm recording externally, so I can't do that. This pretty much has everything you need. You really don't have to dive into the specific menus a lot deeper anymore, and I don't know if I'm even going to be using the function button anymore because pretty much everything is in here. I usually relied on the function button to get a lot of my settings quickly, but everything's in here. It's super cool. And this is very reminiscent of like the FX6, which has like a sort of a quick access menu. So I love this. All right, let's see what's in here. So we can change the frame rate, the shutter speed, the aperture, which of course we can control in the camera too. We have the base ISO and the exposure index. We'll talk about this with the shooting modes. We'll come back to that. That's a big part of this new upgrade. We have the white balance, which LUT you're applying, because you can use custom LUTs now. So again, that's another cool thing. We also have the file format, so you can change that here. This is the bitrate options, which will be based on which file format you have and all that stuff. You can change turning the display LUT on and off. Proxy recording, wind noise reduction, and audio. That's the first page. If you go down to the second page, this is where you're going to change your log shooting settings. As I said, we'll get into this. There's a lot of things I want to talk about with that. You can change your Super 35 settings in 1080p. You can format your card. You can change from card 1 to card 2, your file settings, exposure mode, steady shot, focus mode, focus area, the eye detect and face detect settings. So basically everything is in this part of the new main menu system, which I absolutely love. As I said, it kind of eliminates needing to use that function button. Now let's talk about the different shooting modes. And this is where this update is very different. And if you've never used an FX6 or an FX9, this is going to be a little bit confusing. And if you're not ready to make that jump to using that style of shooting, you can still shoot it in the sort of normal mode. So this chart here really shows you the differences between all of these different settings. The normal shooting mode is basically how the camera worked before, but you can't shoot in log. If you want to shoot it in normal mode like you had before, you can shoot in the log shooting setting, and this will act just like the camera did before, but you'll be shooting in log. log. And then the big differences are gonna be the Cine EI and the Cine EI quick modes, which are very similar, and we'll get into all of those details. Now let's go through all these, and I wanna show you what they do, and I'll make a separate video probably about Cine EI because it's a very different way of shooting, but I'll give you an overall idea of how it works in this video, but it is a little bit confusing if you've never used it. So where do you access this? Let's dive into the camera. So press the menu button. Where you're gonna find this is in the main menu too, but you can also find it in other places. So like I can see it here for log shooting settings, but as I said, you're probably not gonna dive into the menu anymore. You're probably just gonna be using these main menus. All right, so flexible ISO is one of the options. So if we go in here and we select it, you can see you have off, flexible ISO, Cine EI quick, and Cine EI, like I just mentioned, those are different shooting modes. I'm not gonna change it to off because it'll reset my recorder, but off is like the camera was before, you just can't shoot in log, but actually you can shoot in log if you go in and just change one of the picture profiles to S-Log3, but either way, you're probably not gonna be doing that very often, but you can do that. It'll just shoot in all the normal picture profiles. I think you can shoot in S-Cinetone as well. The camera will operate just like it did before. Flexible ISO is basically the same as off, but now you're shooting in S-Log3, but it still works just like it did before. And they took out S-Log2, which is fine. You should be shooting S-Log3 in this camera. So no differences there. Before I jump into Cine EI, I have to talk a little bit more generally about this camera to help you understand it. Before this upgrade, all of us know that this camera has a dual base ISO of 640 and 12,800, which is the same. As I said, the camera works exactly the same if you're shooting in the off mode or the flexible ISO mode. But when you jump into Cine EI mode, that changes. It actually changes the base ISOs from 640 and 12,800 to 800 and 12,800. So the lower base ISO is now 800, which is the same as the FX6. I was always confused why these cameras had the same sensor, but the FX6 had a base ISO of 800 and this camera had one at 640. Now that we know that the base ISOs in Cine EI mode are gonna be 800 and 12,800, again, you have to think about this very differently. Basically, in Cine EI mode, the camera only has 2 ISO settings. So when you're used to shooting on a mirrorless camera, you know, you can just turn up the ISO and you increase the exposure and the noise. Everyone understands how that works. But now there's only 2 settings, and those are the base ISOs. You can either shoot at 800 or 12,800. There's nothing in between. So once you understand that, it's a very different way to shoot, and not everyone's ready for that. So let me explain that a little bit further. So if I'm outside, I'll set it at the base ISO of 800. And to control my exposure, of course, the shutter angle, we're gonna leave that locked in. So for 24 frames a second, I'll be at 1/50. I'll change the exposure using an ND filter and the aperture. Now, if I'm in a situation where it's very dark and I can't increase the light, for example, I will bump up to 12,800, the second base ISO, and then control the exposure with, again, the aperture and maybe ND if I need to. So you can shoot at either one. So let me show you what that looks like in the camera. So of course, when I go into the main menu here, like I was showing you before, we're gonna choose Cine EI and sgamut3.cine and S-Log3. Notice here there's no S-Log2. The embed, we'll talk about that a little bit later with the LUT. So if we exit the screen here, you can see at the bottom, you have something that looks very different to most of you. That's the 800 EI 6.0 E, that's the exposure, and L stands for the lower base ISO. So let me show you really quickly. If I take the cap off my camera here, if I change the ISO like I normally would, and I turn that wheel, you can see it goes up, and you see that the exposure looks different on the screen. Now, when you actually look at the file, the exposure is not gonna change. So this is just giving you a sense of what that noise will do, but it doesn't actually change the image. So as I said, I wanna make a separate video about Cine EI because it's definitely a very different way of thinking about it, but frankly, just you can either shoot at 800 or 12,800. So let me show you how you can change that. So if you go back in the menu and you go to the first My Menu page, or main menu page, this is what I skipped over before. So you can choose the base of 800 or 12,800. So this is the only way that you can change the ISO. You can either shoot 800 or 12,800. Now over here is another way you can change the exposure index besides using the ISO like you would normally on the camera. You can change it here too. So we'll leave that at 800. Now I want to hit on Cine EI quick mode really quickly, and really the only difference here is that if you change the exposure index above a certain point, it will automatically change from the low base ISO to the high base ISO. So let me just show you what that looks like. I'm probably gonna be shooting in Cine EI mode all the time, not using the quick, because you gotta be conscious about what you're doing, and I'm not gonna be changing the exposure index very often. So, but let me just show you what it looks like. So if you go into the main menu here, and we go down to where we were before with the log shooting settings, we're gonna change Cine EI to Cine EI quick. and we go back, and on the first page here, you can see you can't change the base ISO anymore because you're in Cine EI Quick. The way that you do that is by changing the exposure index. So you can do this on the back of the camera like I showed you before by just changing what we usually do with changing the ISO. You can change it here. But as I raise the exposure index, you'll see that there is a line here between 2500 and 3200. So as you switch from 2500 to 3200, you're changing the base ISO from 800 to 12,800. So it'll do it automatically for you. So if you can't remember to go in and change the base ISO, this is one way to do it. But I think for me personally, it's probably going to be easier to just remember which one I'm shooting at and just change the base in the settings. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. I hope to make a video about Cine EI coming up soon to help everyone understand that better. If you want to get a jump on it, try to understand it more, Alistair Chapman made a great video about it it's on the FX9, which I'll leave a link down below, but it'll give you a better idea about what's going on there. All right, now let's talk about some of the other features here. I think one thing that's really cool is the screen layout. So if you take a look here while you're shooting, it definitely looks different. So before all the settings and stuff were on top of the image. Now the screen that comes with this camera is not a wide screen like a 16:9 or 17:9. It's set up for photo. I think it's like a 3:2 or somewhere around there. So this actually shows you the image you're shooting and puts the settings above it so you can see the screen clearly. Huge upgrade. I really, really love this feature. And I have to say that when you're looking at it, there really isn't that much on the screen that you don't want to use. And if you press the display button, you can get your histogram, which is I always leave on. And if you go up more, you get the level. You know, these are all the different things you can toggle through. So overall though, huge upgrade to just the general shooting experience. Now let's talk about LUTs, because this is a huge difference for the FX3 now. And you can change the LUTs that you use. You can also import LUTs if you want to bring in your own LUT or from another creator or whatever. I don't really use LUTs, but I want to show you how this works because I know this is going to be helpful for a lot of people. So if we dive into the menu system here, in the main menu 1, this is where you can select your LUT. So the ones here, we have S-Log3. That's basically no LUT. That's what S-Log3 looks like out of the camera. S709 is the Rec 709 from Sony. That's kind of the standard LUT that I use for monitoring on the camera. So it gives you a really good judge of the image. And you can also add your own user LUTs. So I do want to show you that. But let me go back here and show you that this is where you can turn the LUT on and off. Now this doesn't bake the LUT into the image, it's just for monitoring, but we'll talk about the embed feature a little bit later, as I mentioned. So to bring a LUT into your camera, the first thing you want to do is format your card in the camera because there's a new folder structure that is different from the old system. So make sure you format the card. Once you put the card in your computer, this is the folder structure that you want to get into to find the right folder. It's under Private, Sony, Pro, and LUT. So that's the folder that you want to copy your LUT into, and make sure that you're using a cube file that's either a 17 or a 33 point LUT, then it should work. Now that you got your LUT on the card and you got it on your camera, let me show you how to bring it into the camera. So if we go back to the main menu and down on the left for the exposure, we're going to go to page 5, color tone, which is page 19 of 52. And we're going to select manage user LUTs and import. And then we have, I think, up to 16 that you can put in ahead of time. So you have a lot of different options when you're out shooting. And we're going to select that, select slot 1. And then this is the LUT that I brought in. This is a LUT I downloaded from the Sony website. It's one from Alistair Chapman. As I said, I don't really use LUTs, but whatever LUTs you want to use, you can bring them in here. I know a lot of people are using phantom LUTs and love them, so you can easily bring that in here. So we click on that and select it. So that now brings the LUT into the camera. It's all set up. So if we go back to the menu, we go back to our main menu, like I was showing you before, where you select the LUT, we can choose our LUT. So this is the LUT that I just chose. So now that's in the camera and you can use it just as is, and you can turn the LUT on and off right here. I skipped over this earlier, but I want to talk about the embed LUT feature in this camera, and it's different from what I thought it was going to be. I was hoping that it would bake the LUT into the file, and then when you brought the file into your computer, it would already have the LUT applied. That's not what it does. It adds it to the metadata, which is helpful for some situations. So when you are using, I think, Sony's Catalyst Browse, maybe Premiere Pro, I'm not sure, I don't use Premiere Pro, but when I brought into Final Cut, it didn't show up in the metadata, so it wasn't really helpful for me. But let me just show you where it is anyway. So if you go into the main, this is where I skipped over earlier. If you go to the main menu and you go to the log shooting settings, this is the embed LUT file. You can turn it on and off here. And basically, you can see this in the camera too. I can't do this because it'll reset my recorder. But when you play back the file, it'll show on the actual screen which LUT we're shooting with, so you know like which one to apply when you go back and do the editing. Those are the big features. Let's get on to some of the other ones here. One is the monitor flip, which is really cool. And this one, if we go to the briefcase at the bottom and number 6, we go to monitor. The monitor flip direction. So when you set that to auto, it's really cool because when you're filming yourself, it actually reverses the screen. So when you're talking and you're looking at things, it's not reversed. It matches up. It's kind of like when you're using your phone and you can see what you're doing because it reverses it for you. But you know, most of the time when you're recording on your phone, you'll see that like writing and stuff is backwards. So it looks backwards on the screen, doesn't record that way, but super handy when you're filming yourself. They also added a time code feature here, which you have to get a special cable, which goes in the side of the camera. Of course, I don't have the cable and I don't really use time code, but for a lot of people who are pairing this camera with an FX6 or FX9 or other cinema cameras, the ability to get time code in this camera is absolutely huge. Another little feature they added was the fact that you can swipe up on the screen and that'll bring up the function menu, which, as I said earlier, I'm probably not going to use that often anymore because most of the settings are in that main menu section. Well, that wraps up the new features for the firmware update for the FX3. Again, if you're shooting on mirrorless cameras, this can take some getting used to, but if you're shooting on an FX6 or FX9, these are welcomed updates and really allow you to match this camera even closer to those other cameras. Now, I'm curious why they didn't put the full cinema operating system in this camera. I really wish that we saw the same implementation they did with the Canon R5C. So if you're shooting in photo mode, you get the photo menu. When you're shooting in video, you get the cinema video menu. I would love to have seen that in this camera. But I have a couple of theories about this. And of course, I don't know all the hardware behind it, but they have the same sensor. I assume a lot of the hardware is the same inside of these cameras. So there's two things I have in mind. First of all, this could be like a sort of a Canon cripple that's going on here where they're trying to protect the FX6 from people just buying the FX3, because if this did everything the FX6 did, I think it'd be hard to buy the FX6 in a lot of situations. Of course, there's some other hardware things like the built-in ND filter, SDI out, those sorts of things. But the other thing is that if you bought this camera and you already own it and you're using it, and they just totally changed the menu system from something that you already know and experience and understand as a mirrorless camera operator and just threw a whole new menu system in there, I think that might confuse a lot of owners. So maybe that's it too. Not really sure, but I really wish they had put that split operating system like in the R5C. That's what I was really hoping for. Now let's get on to the missing features, or sort of my wish list of things I was hoping would come in this update. First of all, shutter angle. I think this is probably one of the biggest things that they left out and they should have put in this camera. This is a cinema line camera. It's badged on the camera. Now we have more cinema features. We're still stuck with shutter speed, so that's a bummer. Waveform. Now, this camera should have better built-in exposure assist tools, and waveform is in the FX6. I was hoping that would be in the FX3. It's not. False color would have been amazing, but that was a big stretch because that's not even the FX6. Focus breathing compensation. I'm just really shocked that we're not seeing that in the A7S III or the FX3. Because it is on the FX6, I really thought it would be put into this camera. It is not. So you can only get it in the A7 IV and the FX6. I would have loved the ability to adjust the noise reduction in this camera. Again, that's something that's in the FX6 and not in the FX3. You always have the baked-in noise reduction in this camera. You can't adjust it. And the last thing, give us DCI. It's the same sensor as the FX6. It's still stuck with shooting UHD on this camera. All right, so that was a lot about this firmware update. I'm gonna have to play with this even more to get used to all this stuff, but more videos coming out about this. So if you're interested in that, please consider hitting subscribe down below. I've been doing content on Canon and Sony, videography, content creation, and of course, camera gear. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.